Hello my beautiful cultured pearls, welcome to Pearline Love Jones. You are listening to Resilience Through the Storm, the story of Abigail Newsom finding love after her storm. The diagnosis. The word echoed in the quiet apartment, heavy and clinical. Cancer. Abigail Newsom sank into her living room couch, closing her eyes. Her rich, dark skin felt cold, and she reached up to nervously tuck a stray braid behind her ear. Breathe, Abby. Breathe, she whispered aloud, trying to anchor herself. She was 31, a psychologist who spent her days helping others navigate their emotional storms, yet she was entirely unprepared for her own. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her mother had passed away from bone cancer, at the age of 39, during Abby's freshman year of college. She knew the road ahead. She knew the theft of energy, the hollowed-out cheeks, the quiet terror. When her phone vibrated against the coffee table, she answered it, her voice trembling just enough to betray her fear. "Hello. Hey baby," came Quincy's familiar, dismissive tone. "I've been calling you, where've you been?" He didn't wait for an answer, he was already rushing ahead. "I had an appointment," Abby replied softly. "Oh, Terrell and Angie are coming over tonight," Quincy said matter-of-factly. "Since Terrell and I have that proposal to finish, I thought it'd be good for us to make it a little get-together. You good with that, aren't you?" "I have an early appointment tomorrow morning," Abigail started, thinking of the 8:15 a.m. slot she had just booked to discuss her oncology treatment plan. "That's okay. You don't have to do much, just make something simple. I'll pick up the drinks," Quincy said smoothly. "Okay, Quincy," Abby replied, too exhausted to fight the current. "Thanks, babe." He hung up. Abby stared at the blank screen. They had been together for 5 years, not married, just committed. Or so Quincy called it. He kept his own apartment for convenience, but lived in her space, eating her food, and letting her quiet resilience absorb his chaotic get-rich-quick whims. Looking at her phone, a stark reality crystallized in her mind. Quincy was a fair-weather partner. He was a man who demanded a simple dinner while she was staring down mortality. She didn't see him as a husband, and deep down, she knew he wouldn't survive her sickness. He would resent it. Abby sat quietly on the edge of her bed, her eyes distant as memories flooded her mind. She closed her eyes and the scene unfolded like a fragile film. Her mother, frail yet still radiant in her own way, lying in the hospital bed surrounded by soft shadows and the faint hum of medical equipment. It was the last week of her mother's life, and the air was thick with unspoken goodbyes. Her mother's skin was pale, almost translucent, her once vibrant bones now fragile under the weight of the disease. Abby remembered how her mother had held her hand tightly that day, her voice weak but filled with gentle strength. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her eyes shining with love and a quiet courage that refused to fade. Abby's father sat nearby, his face hollowed out with grief. He hadn't spoken much during those final days, but his eyes betrayed a storm of emotions. Heartbreak, helplessness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. She remembered how he would sit by her mother's bedside for hours, clutching her hand, tears silently streaming down his face when he thought no one was looking. The day her mother finally took her last breath, her father broke. He didn't cry out loud, but his body quivered with silent anguish. He seemed to shrink into himself, as if the weight of the loss had physically driven him into a different world. That night he sat in the dark, staring at the wall, unmoving, as if his soul had been drained from his body. In the weeks that followed, her father's grief became a silent, heavy presence in their home. He withdrew into himself, haunted by the memory of her mother's suffering and her passing. No amount of comforting words could reach him, and Abby watched as her father's spirit seemed to fracture further, never quite recovering from that devastating loss. A legacy of compassion. 2 years later, Abby's father, unable to bear the emptiness of that loss, had channeled his grief into something meaningful. He founded a non-profit organization called Hope's Anchor, named after her mother, dedicated to supporting cancer warriors and their families. She remembered visiting the small office he established downtown Stone Mountain, a modest space filled with pamphlets, support group flyers, and photos of families he had helped. He had poured his pain into this mission, organizing fundraising events, support circles, and providing financial assistance for those battling cancer. Abby remembered the pride in his eyes when he told her, "If I can help one family navigate the heartbreak we went through, then her suffering will have some purpose." As she sat in her quiet apartment now, Abby felt the echo of her father's resilience, the way he refused to let despair consume him, instead choosing to give hope to others. It was a lesson she carried deep within her, fueling her own fight and her capacity to help others navigate their storms, just as her father had done, is still doing. The shift. The dinner party was a blur of Quincy's loud laughter and Terrell's grand financial schemes. Abby moved through the kitchen like a ghost, serving pasta and nodding politely to Angie. Quincy never noticed the dark circles under her eyes, nor the way her hands shook when she handed him a plate. The next morning, Abby drove herself to the medical center in downtown Atlanta. The waiting room was bright, sterile and lonely. Dr. Abigail Newsom? Abby stood up, smoothing her dress. The man who called her name wasn't the nurse from the phone. He was a tall, deep brown complexion, broad-shouldered man, wearing a white coat over a soft gray sweater. His dark eyes were warm, and he held her chart with a gentle familiarity. "I'm Dr. Julian Vance," he said, offering a hand. His grip was warm and grounding. "Let's go back to my office." Sitting across from him, Abby braced for the worst. But Dr. Vance didn't just read statistics. He looked at her. Really looked at her. "I reviewed your pathology report, Abigail," Julian said, his voice a calm, deep baritone that seemed to lower her heart rate. "It is Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's serious, and we need to start chemotherapy next week. But I want you to look at me. This is highly treatable. We are going to fight this, and you are not going to do it alone." For the first time in 24 hours, Abby felt a tear slip down her cheek. "My mother died of bone cancer when I was 18, she whispered. "I know what it looks like." Julian paused. He set the chart down on his desk, closing the distance between them. He didn't offer hollow platitudes. "I am so sorry for your loss, but medicine has changed, and your story is not your mother's. I will be with you every step of the way, Abby. As your doctor, and as your advocate." Hearing him call her Abby felt like a lifeline. He spent the next hour explaining the treatment, answering her psychological questions about coping mechanisms, and listening to her talk about her father in Stone Mountain. Julian was observant, sharp, and entirely focused on her. The breaking point. 3 weeks into treatment, the side effects hit Abby like a freight train. She sat on the bathroom floor, clutching the toilet, nausea racking her body. The bathroom door swung open. Quincy stood there, dressed in a sharp suit, looking annoyed. "Abby, seriously, the smell in here is awful. And you forgot to restock the coffee pods. I have a huge meeting with an investor today." Abby stood up from the floor, bracing herself on the sink. Her braids were tied back, her skin looked muted, and her eyes were hollow. "I'm having a rough morning, Quincy. I need you to go to the pharmacy and pick up my anti-nausea prescription." Quincy sighed, checking his watch. "Can't you call your dad for that? Stone Mountain isn't that far. I really can't miss this meeting, babe. This new tech startup is a sure thing." Something clicked inside Abigail. The psychologist in her recognized the finality of a dead bond. The woman in her simply chose survival. "Get out," she said softly. "What? Get out of my apartment, Quincy. Pack your things, go to your convenience apartment, and don't come back. Abby, you're just being emotional because of the meds." "I am dying, or trying not to," Abby said, her voice dropping to a steady, chilling whisper that stopped him cold. "And you are a distraction. Leave." By the time she returned from her afternoon hydration appointment, Quincy's things were gone. The apartment was empty, quiet, and for the first time in 5 years, Abby felt like she could breathe. Dreamy came to take Abby to her treatment, her presence calm and reassuring. She listened intently as Abby recounted the morning incident with Quincy, her expression careful, as if she didn't want to jump to conclusions before understanding the full story. Dreamy and Abby had been friends since college. Over the years they shared joys, pains, accomplishments and routines. When Abby told Dreamy about her diagnosis, Dreamy immediately shifted her entire schedule to ensure she would be available for every appointment, no matter what. As Abby finished explaining her and Quincy's breakup, Dreamy nodded softly and said, "I am proud of you." Those words had always been a source of comfort for Abby, but today, they carried a particularly profound weight that grounded her in a way she desperately needed. Dreamy had never liked Quincy. She thought he was a grifter, a smooth talker who was only after what he could get. She had told Abby as much, warning her to be cautious. Yet, she had accepted him while he was involved with Abby, respecting her friend's choices even if she didn't agree. The aftermath of Abby's chemo treatment was especially brutal this time. She was dangerously exhausted and dehydrated. Dreamy called her husband to inform him she would be staying the night at Abby's, just out of caution and support. The rest of the night was spent in quiet, tender care. Dreamy gently held Abby's hair as she fought to keep the clear soup she had just eaten from refusing. her presence a steadying anchor in the darkness of her illness. A new beginning. 11 months later, the Atlanta spring was in full bloom. Abby walked into the oncology clinic with a colorful silk scarf wrapped beautifully around her head. Her chemo treatments, followed by 6 weeks of radiation, were finally coming to an end. Julian was waiting for her in the examination room. When he saw her, his face lit up with a brilliant smile that reached his eyes. "Well, look at you," Julian said, pulling up her latest scans on the monitor. "I have the official radiology report. You are in complete remission, Abby." Abby gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The tears came, but this time, they were warm and sweet. Julian didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her. Holding him, Abby realized how much she had come to rely on his strength over the past months. He had checked on her constantly, adjusted her appointments to fit her good days, and treated her like a human being, not just a patient. As they pulled apart, Julian's hands lingered gently on her shoulders. He looked down at her, his expression shifting from professional joy to something deeply personal. "Now that you are officially no longer my patient," Julian said softly, his voice trembling just a fraction, "and since I am transferring my residency to Emory next week, I wanted to ask you something." Abby looked up at him, her heart doing a strange, beautiful flutter she hadn't felt in years. "What's that, Dr. Vance? Would you let me take you out to dinner? Somewhere far away from the smell of rubbing alcohol and hospital gowns." "I want to know Abigail the psychologist, not just Abigail the warrior." Abby smiled, the rich warmth returning to her dark skin, her eyes bright with a future she could finally see. "I'll take the 8 to 15, she teased softly, recalling the time of her very first appointment. Julian laughed, a rich, happy sound. "It's a date." Quincy returns. 9 months had passed since Julian and Abby's first official date, and the world felt entirely renewed. Abby was now in complete remission. Atlanta's spring was in full bloom, the vibrant colors of the city perfectly matching the newfound vitality in her life. Her hair was returning in a halo of soft, healthy curls, her energy had fully bounced back, and her heart belonged completely to Julian. They had been careful, waiting until she was officially discharged as his patient, before ever transitioning from medicine to romance. By keeping everything strictly above board, they had protected his career and her peace of mind. Now, with the shadow of her illness finally behind them, they were free to just love each other. One Saturday afternoon, Abby was sitting at a quiet, sun-drenched patio table at a bistro in Midtown, waiting for Julian. Instead, a shadow fell over her table. "Abby?" She looked up. Quincy stood there, looking less like the smooth-talking financial advisor, and more like a man who had been losing sleep. He looked at her vibrant skin and the stylish scarf around her neck, his eyes widening. "You look incredible, Abby." "Quincy," she said, her voice completely neutral. "What are you doing here?" Without asking, he pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning across the table. "I've been looking for you. Abby, please just hear me out. I made a massive mistake, but you have to understand why I acted the way I did. When you told me you were sick, I froze. I was absolutely terrified of losing you." Abby stared at him, incredulous. "Terrified? You asked me to make pasta for your friends and refused to get my medication. Because acting like you weren't sick was the only way I could cope," Quincy pleaded, his voice rising slightly, entirely earnest in his own delusion. "If I acknowledged it, it made it real. I thought if I kept things normal, you'd stay normal. It was my way of protecting myself from the thought of losing you like you lost your mum. I love you, Abby. Let me come home." Before Abby could process the sheer selfishness of his logic, Julian walked onto the patio. He was out of his scrubs, wearing jeans and a tailored jacket. He smiled warmly at Abby, then noticed Quincy. "Everything all right here, Abby?" Julian asked gently. Quincy's eyes darted between them, taking in the easy familiarity, the way Julian's hand naturally brushed Abby's shoulder, and the sheer adoration in Abby's eyes. A dark, ugly realization washed over Quincy's face. "Is this him?" Quincy sneered, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped the concrete. "The doctor? You threw away 5 years with me for the guy who was supposed to be treating you." "Quincy, leave right now," Abby warned, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper. "This is completely inappropriate," Quincy hissed, his eyes flashing with a toxic mix of jealousy and wounded pride. "He was your doctor, Abby. This is a violation." You think you can just discard me and ride off into the sunset with him? We'll see about that. He turned on his heel and stormed away into the Atlanta traffic. The allegation. Quincy paced his apartment, seething. His gaze flicked from the eviction notice to the messy stack of utility cut-off warnings, finally landing on the rejection letter from their 9th potential investor. It was the final nail in the coffin for his and Terrell's proposal. Time was his biggest enemy now. He just needed a place to stay while he figured out his next move. He needed her. Winning Abby back wasn't going to be easy, but he had always managed to bend her to his will eventually. As the reality sank in that his world was being repossessed piece by piece, he refused to believe this time would be any different. A little more effort, sure, but the same result. Except, during their last encounter, he had seen her. Really seen her. For the first time, he realized he didn't know this new version of Abby. And he knew that Julian had something to do with her newfound assertiveness. After everything they had been through, she was just going to discard him like rotten meat? His mind spiraled, his anger growing hotter, crowding out the air in the empty apartment. No, he needed a roof over his head, and he needed someone to hold him down while he rebuilt his life. He needed her. He just had to get this Julian guy out of the picture. As his thoughts raced, malice crystallized into a sudden epiphany. That's it, Quincy said aloud to the empty room. The ethics board. I'll report him to the ethics board. He immediately began drafting the plan in his head. For a brief, fleeting second he tried to lie to himself, to pretend he was doing this because he'd made a mistake, because he truly loved Abby. But deep down he knew exactly what she was to him, a resource. One he would gladly discard the moment he was back on his feet. 3 days later the fallout landed. Julian called Abby, his voice tight and strained, a tone she had never heard from him before. Quincy had filed a formal scorched earth complaint with the Georgia Composite Medical Board and the hospital administration. He accused Julian of leveraging his position as Abby's primary oncologist to initiate an inappropriate, unethical sexual relationship while she was actively undergoing cancer treatment. The hospital's policy was swift and unyielding. Pending a full investigation by the medical board, Julian was placed on immediate, unpaid suspension. His upcoming residency transfer to Emory was put on a frozen hold. The next 2 months were an excruciating test of endurance. For Julian, medicine wasn't just a career. It was his identity. Being barred from his patients and facing the potential revocation of his medical license was a psychological execution. He spent his days pacing his apartment, reviewing legal precedents, and agonizing over the optics of their timeline. Abby, meanwhile, felt a crushing wave of guilt. She was the reason this brilliant, compassionate man's life was being dismantled. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Abby sat on Julian's living room rug, files scattered around them. Julian was staring out the window, his jaw clenched tightly. "Julian," Abby said softly, walking over and placing her hands on his chest. "Look at me." He looked down, the exhaustion evident in the shadows under his eyes. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice a steady anchor. "We followed every ethical guideline. We waited until I was completely discharged from your care. Quincy is using the system to punish me for putting him out. He's using you as the weapon. But I am a psychologist, Julian. I know how to dismantle a narcissist narrative. We are going to fight this, and you are not going to do it alone." Julian let out a long breath, a faint, grateful smile touching his lips. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I'm supposed to be the one protecting you, Abby." "Relationships are a partnership, Dr. Vance," she whispered, holding him tight. "Right now it's my turn to hold the line." They refused to let Quincy's malice poison their bond. Instead of pulling apart to save appearances, they leaned into each other. They established a rigid routine. Mornings were for legal strategy and building their defense timeline. Afternoons were for long walks through Piedmont Park, deliberately focusing on life, recovery, and their future. They proved to be an unbreakable unit. Vindication. The day of the formal hearing arrived. The medical board review panel sat behind a long oak table in a sterile conference room. Quincy's lawyer painted a picture of a vulnerable, grieving cancer patient manipulated by an opportunistic physician. But their narrative lacked one crucial element: the facts. Abby took the stand. Calm, poised, and utilizing her professional background, she presented herself not as a victim, but as a highly educated, self-aware woman. She provided detailed logs of her treatment timeline. "Dr. Vance maintained absolute, impeccable professional boundaries throughout my entire battle with lymphoma," Abby testified, looking the board members dead in the eye. "He saved my life. Our personal relationship began weeks after my formal discharge, a timeline that completely complies with the ethical statutes of the Georgia Medical Board. This complaint is not an act of whistleblowing. It is a malicious act of retaliation by a disgruntled ex-partner." Julian's legal counsel presented the hospital's electronic logging system, proving that Julian had officially transferred Abby's follow-up care to a general practitioner before their first social outing. Furthermore, they submitted Quincy's text messages to Abby from the day at the bistro, texts filled with explicit threats to ruin them both because she refused to take him back. 2 weeks later, the certified letter arrived. Abby was at Julian's apartment when he tore open the envelope. He read the document, and the immense tension that had held his shoulders square for months suddenly evaporated. He dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands. "Julian?" Abby gasped, kneeling beside him. "Not liable," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. The complaint was dismissed as entirely unsubstantiated. "My license is fully restored, Abby. The Emory transfer goes through on Monday." Abby threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying all at once. They had survived the cancer, they had survived the ghost of her past, and they had survived the system meant to tear them apart. Quincy's final reaction. The text notification from Terrell arrived like a slap to the face. "Charges dropped. Vance is completely vindicated. It's over." Quincy stared at the glowing screen, his chest tightening as a cold, sharp panic set in. The ethics board complaint had backfired spectacularly. Not only was Vance cleared, but the blowback had demolished the fragile house of cards Quincy had been building. The few freelance contracts he'd managed to secure through lies and exaggerated credentials vanished within hours as word spread. Then came the repossession of his car, followed swiftly by the final lockout notice on his apartment door. Nobody was answering his calls. Terrell had blocked him, his old professional contacts ignored his emails, and his family had finally cut him off. For the first time in his life, Quincy had absolutely no one left to manipulate. He was entirely, terrifyingly alone. With nothing but a single duffel bag of clothes, he had been forced to check into a crowded municipal shelter downtown. The nights were a loud, chaotic nightmare of snoring strangers, and the overwhelming stench of institutional cleaner, a brutal contrast to the life of luxury he always assumed he deserved. To keep from starving, he took the only job that didn't require a background check, working the night shift as a parking lot attendant for a high-end steakhouse downtown. Dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting neon vest, Quincy stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the attendant's booth, clutching a clipboard. The winter air bit through his thin jacket as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the valet curb. Quincy stepped forward to log the vehicle, but stopped dead in his tracks. Through the tinted glass of the passenger side he saw her, Abby. She was laughing, her face radiant and entirely free of the tension that used to define it when they were together. The driver's side door opened, and Julian stepped out, tossing a crisp $50 bill to the lead valet before walking around to open Abby's door. He caught her hand, pulling her close as they walked toward the restaurant's canopy. Panic seized Quincy. His stomach dropped, a sickening wave of heat rushing to his face despite the freezing wind. He instinctively ducked his head, turning his back to them and pretending to study the clipboard, praying the shadows of the booth would swallow him whole. He couldn't let them see him like this, stripped of his pride, wearing a neon vest, breathing in exhaust fumes for minimum wage. "Good evening, enjoy your night," the lead valet called out. As Julian and Abby stepped onto the heated sidewalk just feet away, Abby paused. She glanced toward the booth. Quincy held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the corner of his eye, he saw her gaze lock onto him. The recognition was instant. There was no mistaking the shape of his shoulders, the posture of a man trying to shrink into nothingness. Quincy braced himself for the mockery, the smug satisfaction, or even the pity. Pity would have killed him. But nothing came. Abby didn't gasp. She didn't point. Her expression didn't even flicker with anger. She simply looked at him with a profound, empty neutrality, as if he were nothing more than a piece of stray trash blowing across the asphalt. Then, without breaking stride or missing a beat in her conversation with Julian, she turned her head and walked through the restaurant's glass doors. She didn't even care enough to hate him. The heavy doors closed, shutting out the warmth and the low murmur of jazz music from inside. Quincy stood frozen in the cold, his hands shaking against the clipboard. The anger that had fueled him for months suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, crushing weight. The illusion was completely gone. Looking at the closed doors, the reality of his ruin finally settled in. He hadn't just lost his apartment, his car, or his career. He had genuinely, irrevocably destroyed his own life, and there was no plotting his way out of it. New beginning. That evening, standing on the patio under the Atlanta twilight, Julian raised his glass to Abby. "To new beginnings," Julian said, his eyes bright with an unshakable love. "And to the woman who held the line." Abby clinked her glass against his, the rich warmth of her smile radiating in the evening light. "To us, always." But as the night wore on, the bustling atmosphere of the restaurant began to fade into the background. The adrenaline of their victory, the relief of the cleared charges, and the months of pent-up tension transformed into a magnetic, heavy pulling between them. Every accidental brush of their hands across the table felt charged with electricity. By the time Julian paid the bill, the conversation had fallen away, replaced by an intense, burning awareness of each other. They barely made it through the door of Julian's apartment before the door clicked shut, and the rest of the world was locked out. Julian turned, his eyes dark with a fierce protective desire. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out, his large hands framing Abby's face, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones. Abby looked up at him, her breath hitching at the sheer intensity in his gaze. "I love you, Abby," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I almost lost everything, but as long as I have you, I'm whole." "You have me," she breathed. "Completely." Julian leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was both desperate and deeply tender. It wasn't the careful, hesitant kiss of their early dating days. It was a passionate declaration of survival. Abby wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, as she opened up to him. The kiss deepened, hot and demanding, pouring all the fear, the anger of the past months, and the ultimate joy of their freedom into the embrace. He lifted her effortlessly, and Abby wrapped her legs around his waist, laughing softly against his lips as he carried her down the short hallway to the bedroom. The moonlight poured through the large windows, casting long, silver shadows across the sheets. Julian lowered her onto the mattress, following her down so that the weight of his body pressed reassuringly against hers. His hands were eager but reverent as he began to undo the buttons of her blouse. Abby helped him, tugging at his jacket, needing to feel the warmth of his skin against hers. When their clothes were discarded, Julian paused, leaning over her on his elbows. He looked down at her body, at the pale fade of the port scar near her collarbone, a reminder of the battle she had fought and won. Gently, he pressed a soft, lingering kiss directly over the scar. A shiver of pure devotion ran through Abby's veins. He wasn't just loving the healthy, restored woman, he loved every part of her journey. "You are so beautiful," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. Abby pulled his head down, kissing him with a fierce passion that left no room for doubt. She wanted him. She needed him. Their movements became a slow, intoxicating rhythm. Every touch was an unspoken promise, every breathless sigh a testament to how far they had come. When he finally slid into her, joining their bodies completely, a soft gasp escaped Abby's lips. It was an explosion of raw emotion and physical sensation, a perfect alignment of mind, body, and soul. They moved together in the moonlit quiet, a beautiful, passionate dance of two people who had looked into the abyss and chosen to climb out together. Julian's hands gripped hers, fingers intertwined tightly on the pillows, grounding her as the pleasure built, rolling over them like a wave. The world outside completely dissolved, leaving only the heat of their skin, the sound of their synchronized breathing, and the overwhelming depth of their love. As the final shattering release claimed them both, Julian held her tightly against his chest, whispering her name into the crook of her neck. Afterward, the room was silent, save for the steady, calming thrum of Julian's heartbeat beneath Abby's ear. She lay curled against his side, her rich dark skin beautifully contrasted against the white sheets, his strong arm wrapped securely around her waist. Julian kissed the top of her head, his fingers gently playing with the soft curls of her growing hair. They had survived the cancer, they had shattered the ghost of her past, and they had conquered the storm together. Safe in the quiet of the night, they finally had everything they had fought for. And that brings us to the end of Abby and Julian's journey today. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me, my cultured pearls. I hope this story resonated with you. If so, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates the beauty of our blended traditions. Our quest to grow our channel can only be achieved with your incredible support. Every like, share, and subscribe truly means the world to us and allows us to continue bringing you these incredible stories of love. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What part of today's narrative resonated with you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what part of the world you are joining us from.